In a mystical Hausa village where truth always returns, a poor farm girl's secret pregnancy becomes the key to saving a fallen crown prince, until envy turns her best friend into a ruthless rival, exposing a palace conspiracy and proving that the throne belongs not to the loudest claimant, but to the truest heart. She ran, bare feet pounding red earth, lungs burning, the sounds of hoofbeats growing louder behind her. Zainab did not look back. She could not. One stumble and everything would be lost, not just her life, but the life growing quietly inside her, and the truth that the kingdom had been lied to for over a year. The forest swallowed her whole. She pressed herself behind the wide trunk of a silk cotton tree, both hands pressed flat against her rounded belly, breathing through her nose the way her mother had taught her to calm a frightened goat. The hoofbeats slowed. Voices carried through the dark, rough, clipped, the voices of palace guards who had never once in their careers hunted a pregnant farm girl. But tonight they had been given orders. Find her, bring her back, and tell no one what she carries. She did not move. She waited, and slowly, achingly slowly, the voices faded. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why palace guards were hunting a girl who had done nothing wrong, you must first understand the village of Tudungaskiya and the saying carved above the entrance to its oldest well. Gaskiya bata boy. Truth does not hide. It may sleep for a season, but it always wakes. Tudungaskiya sat between two hills in a valley that smelled of dry soil and shea butter. It was not a large village. It had a weekly market, a meeting tree where elders gathered at dusk, and a reputation throughout the surrounding kingdom for producing people with straight backs and straight tongues. The people of Tudungaskiya lied poorly. It was almost a defect. Secrets sat badly on their chests, pressing down like borrowed grief until the truth tumbled out, usually at the worst possible moment. Zainab bint Larai was 18 years old, and she had been keeping her secret for 4 months. She was the daughter of a widow who farmed a small plot of millet and groundnuts near the eastern edge of the village. Her mother, Mama Larai, was the kind of woman who woke before the call to prayer and went to bed after the last star had confirmed it was safe to sleep. She had raised Zainab alone since Zainab's father died from a fever 6 years before. The two of them were not poor in spirit, but they were poor in everything else, in land, in livestock, in connections. What Zainab had was her face, which was honest, and her hands, which were strong, and her heart, which had always been, at its very core, entirely too trusting. Her best friend since childhood was a girl named Hadiza. If Zainab was the kind of girl who looked at the ground and saw what could grow, Hadiza was the kind of girl who looked at the horizon and saw what should be hers. She was beautiful in a way that made men stumble over their sandals, and she had always known it. She had grown up 3 huts from Zainab, and the two of them had been inseparable for as long as either of them could remember, sharing meals, secrets, laughter, and the particular comfort of being known completely by another person. At least, that was what Zainab had believed. The crown prince's name was Sarkin Yarrow Ibrahim, and there was a time, not long ago, when that name had made the whole kingdom exhale with relief. He was the son of the aging king, and he was unlike the princes who had come before him in Hausa legend. He did not drink, did not gamble, did not speak cruelty to servants. He visited villages unannounced, sat under trees with farmers, and listened to things that mattered. People said he had his grandmother's eyes and his grandfather's patience. They said the kingdom would be safe in his hands. Then came the scandal. A document surfaced in the palace, a letter, bearing what appeared to be Ibrahim's seal, communicating in coded language with enemies of the kingdom. Before the ink had time to be questioned, witnesses appeared. Servants who claimed to have seen the prince meeting with foreigners. A treasurer who swore Ibrahim had diverted palace funds. The evidence, all of it planted with the quiet expertise of someone who had spent years thinking about exactly this moment, was overwhelming. The king, old and unwell, and surrounded by advisors he should not have trusted, made his ruling in grief. Ibrahim was stripped of his title and banished from the kingdom. He left in the dark, with 3 loyal companions and a horse, and disappeared into the wider world. The man who had orchestrated every piece of it was the palace's chief minister, a man called Waziri Dauda, clever, composed, and deeply patient. He had served the royal family for 20 years, positioning himself slowly, carefully, like a man arranging a game of stones who has been planning his final move since the very first piece was placed. With Ibrahim gone, the king's second son, young, easily guided, politically inexperienced, would inherit the throne. And behind that young man, Waziri Dada would hold the true power. It was a perfect plan. There was only one thing he had not accounted for. 3 months before the scandal broke, Ibrahim had visited Tudungaskiya on one of his unannounced trips. He had stayed for 4 days, sleeping in the home of a village elder who was an old friend of his late grandmother. And on the third evening, sitting at the meeting tree as the sun bled orange across the hills, he had met a farm girl carrying a clay pot on her head and managing, somehow, to also carry a laugh so unguarded it had stopped him mid-sentence. They had spoken, then spoken again, and on the fourth night before he left before dawn, something had happened between them that was sacred and private and entirely their own. He had pressed his signet ring into her hand. "Keep this," he had said, his voice low and urgent, as though some part of him already sensed what was coming. "Not as a promise of anything. Keep it because I want some part of me to stay here in a place that still feels real." She had kept it. She had kept it in a knotted cloth at the bottom of her grain pot, buried under millet, where no one would think to look. When her body began to change 6 weeks later, she understood what it meant. She prayed. She cried quietly into her wrapper at night so her mother would not hear. And then she did what many frightened girls do when they have no one else. She turned to her best friend. "Hadiza," she said one afternoon, the two of them alone in the field, the sun at its peak and no one within earshot. "I have to tell you something, but you must promise me first. You must promise on your mother's grave." Hadiza had stopped weeding and looked at her fully. "Tell me." "I am with child." Silence then. "Who?" Zainab hesitated. She reached into the fold of her wrapper and pulled out the knotted cloth. She opened it slowly, and the ring caught the afternoon light. Hadiza's eyes went to the ring, then to Zainab's face, then back to the ring. She recognized the crest. Everyone in the kingdom knew that crest. "Zainab," her voice had changed, quiet now, strange. "That is the crown prince's ring." "He gave it to me the night before he left. He was here, Hadiza. He sat with me at the meeting tree. We talked for hours. He was—" She stopped. "He was kind. He was so different from what I expected. I know how this sounds." "He is banished." "I know. People are saying he committed treason." "He did not." Zainab said it with a certainty that surprised even her. "I know what I felt when I was with him. That man is not capable of what they are saying. Something happened. Something is wrong in that palace." Hadiza was quiet for a long moment. Then she placed her hand over Zainab's and squeezed it, and she said, "You are right to trust me. We will figure this out together." She smiled. And Zainab felt the relief pour through her like cool water. She did not see what lived behind that smile. She did not see the calculation, the sudden furious arithmetic of jealousy. Because what Hadiza had felt in that moment of hearing the story was not concern for her friend. It was a hot, immediate rage at the universe's sense of fairness. Hadiza was the beautiful one. Hadiza was the one who had always dreamed of a life beyond this village, beyond this dust and this poverty, beyond the weekly market and the elders and the slow grinding rhythms of farm life. She had thought about the palace since she was a child. She had thought about silk and horses and being seen by someone important. She had thought, in the privacy of her own imagination, that if anyone from this village was ever going to be noticed by a man of consequence, it would be her. And instead it was Zainab. Quiet, plain, hardworking Zainab, who asked for nothing and expected less, who carried clay pots and laughed too loudly, and had somehow, without even trying, ended up carrying the child of the crown prince of the kingdom. Hadiza said nothing of this. She smiled and squeezed the hand and said all the right things. And that night, after Zainab had gone home to her mother, Hadiza lay on her mat and stared at the ceiling and made a decision. 3 days later, she left before sunrise, telling her mother she was going to the market in the next town. Instead, she walked 4 hours to the edge of the kingdom's capital, found the outer gate of the palace district, and asked to speak with someone in authority about information concerning the exiled prince. She was kept waiting for 2 hours, in an anteroom that smelled of cedar and ambition. Then Waziri Dada walked in. He was not what she had expected. She had expected someone loud, someone who announced himself. Instead, he was a thin man in expensive robes, with eyes that moved like water, everywhere at once, taking everything in, giving nothing back. "You said you have information," he said without sitting. "Speak." Hadassah spoke. She told him everything. The pregnancy, the ring, the girl who believed the prince was innocent. She told it all clearly and without emotion because she had rehearsed it in her head 4 times on the walk over. Waziri Dada listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "This child, if it lives and the ring is confirmed." "It would prove he was in the village before the scandal," Hadassah finished. "Which means he was not where the documents say he was, which means the documents are wrong." His voice had dropped to nearly nothing. "Yes." He looked at her the way a man looks at a tool, assessing its utility, its sharpness, the likelihood it would snap under pressure. "You will be rewarded," he said, "generously, but I need something from you first. I need to know where she goes, who she speaks to. I need to know everything. And then I will take care of the rest." Hadassah walked home in the afternoon heat, and she told herself she had done something sensible. She told herself that the world was not fair, and that Zainab was not more deserving than her, and that someone was going to get something from this situation, and it was only reasonable that it be someone who had actually been paying attention. She did not think about the child. In Tudungaskiya, nothing moved quietly. Old Malam Kabir, who sat by the village entrance and watched everything from beneath his collapsed straw hat, noticed the direction Hadassah had come from when she returned. He said nothing. He simply began to watch more closely. 2 days later, the guards arrived. There were 6 of them, on horseback, in palace livery. They did not announce themselves as the enemy. They said only that they were looking for a girl named Zainab bint Larai, that she was wanted in the capital for questioning, and that anyone who interfered with the king's business would face consequences. Malam Kabir stood up very slowly from his chair and walked to the center of the village, and he said something in a calm voice that carried. "Our visitor needs to find her family in the eastern fields. She left before sunrise." The guards rode east. Meanwhile, behind the grain store, 3 women and 2 men passed Zainab hand to hand like something precious, whispering directions, pressing a cloth bundle of food into her arms, pointing her toward the forest path that only the oldest farmers knew. An elder woman named Hajia Rabbi held Zainab's face in both hands and looked at her with the certainty of someone who has lived long enough to recognize which moments matter. "Go," Hajia Rabbi said. "Go to the mill stream, follow it north until you reach the split stone, then go west into the dense section. Sit there, don't make a fire. People will find you." "What people?" "People who have been watching the same things we have been watching." Zainab went. For 3 days she lived in the forest, cared for by a relay of village people who moved in and out with food and water and information, like a secret being passed in whispers. She was frightened. She was exhausted. Her back ached and her feet were swollen, and the child inside her seemed to move more forcefully at night, as though it too understood the urgency of the situation. On the 3rd night, a young man appeared at her hiding place. He was lean and travel-worn and had the look of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. He came alone, without a torch, and he sat across from her in the dark and said nothing for a moment. Then she recognized him. Not his face, the darkness hid that. She recognized his voice when he finally spoke, because it was the voice she had replayed in her memory more times than she had counted. "They told me you were here," Ibrahim said. "I have been nearby for 6 weeks. There are people in this region who believe the truth about what happened. We have been gathering evidence, but I did not know." He stopped. "They told me about the child." "It is yours," she said, because there was nothing else to say. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, softer, weighted with something she could not immediately name. "I am sorry," he said. "That is not enough, but I am sorry." "I do not want your apology." She was surprised by her own steadiness. "I want you to take back what belongs to you." He looked at her in the dark. "What do you mean?" "I have kept something for you." She reached into her wrapper and pulled out the knotted cloth. "You said you wanted some part of yourself to stay somewhere real. I think it is time it goes back to where it belongs." She held out the ring. He took it, and then he pressed both her hands together between his and said, "Not alone. We go together." The royal council gathered at the palace 3 days later for the seasonal assembly, a mandatory meeting of all chiefs, regional leaders, and senior advisors, held in the great courtyard under the shade of ancient neem trees. Waziri Dada had arranged it so that on the following day, the young second son would be formally named as heir, putting the matter of succession beyond legal challenge. He had not accounted for what arrived at the palace gates that morning. Ibrahim walked in through the front entrance with 40 witnesses behind him. Farmers, elders, a village scribe, 2 regional chiefs who had quietly refused to accept the evidence against him, and 1 pregnant farm girl who walked with her back straight and her jaw set, and her hand holding a ring that the whole court recognized on sight. The silence in the courtyard was total. Waziri Dada stood at the back of the assembly. For the first time in 20 years, the composure left his face. What followed was not brief. Truth, when it returns after a long absence, tends to arrive with accumulated force. The regional scribe unrolled documents, the real ones, bearing dates that contradicted the forged evidence. 2 former palace servants stepped forward, having traveled through the night, to recant the testimony they had been paid to give. A court calligrapher compared the seal on the treasonous letter to known examples of Ibrahim's script and seal and demonstrated, in front of the assembly, that the impression had been made with a copy, not the original. There were 3 differences visible to the trained eye. Then Ibrahim stood before the king, his father, and spoke. He did not speak in anger. He spoke in the measured, deliberate cadence of a man who had spent 14 months in exile, thinking very carefully about what words were worth saying and which ones were not. "I did not come back for the throne," he said. "I came back because a woman who did nothing wrong except trust me is carrying my child, and she is being hunted by men who serve a lie. The throne is a consequence of truth. It is not the point." The king was old. His hands trembled. But his eyes were his grandmother's eyes, and they were still sharp, and he looked at his firstborn son for a long moment, and then he looked at the minister who had served him for 20 years, and he understood. Waziri Dada was taken by the king's own guards before he could reach the outer wall. Hadassah had watched everything from the edge of the gathering crowd, having followed the commotion from the village with the blind instinct of someone who knows the situation they helped create is now beyond their control. She had stood in the back, telling herself she could still walk away, that no one knew her role, that she had simply shared information and nothing more. But she had not accounted for Malam Kabir, who had lived for 74 years and spent most of them noticing things. He was standing 3 feet away from her. He did not need to say a word. He simply looked at her. And Hadassah, who had never been good at holding things that felt large and terrible, looked back at him and felt the confession rising in her throat like floodwater against a too small gate. She wept first, then she spoke, not loudly, just enough for those standing near her to hear. And the words passed through the crowd the way words do in Hausa villages, person to person, each repetition exact, until they reached the front and reached Zainab. Zainab heard what her best friend had done. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she turned and found Hadassah in the crowd, and she walked to her, and she stood before her, and she looked at her the way you look at something you loved and thought you knew, and she said one thing. Was it worth it? Hadassah had no answer. There is never an answer to that question when the answer is no. What happened to each of them afterward became its own story, told for years around the meeting tree in Tudun Gaskia and beyond. Waziri Dada faced the king's justice. The specific nature of that justice was deliberated by the council over 3 days, and it was thorough. The forged documents were publicly burned. The servants who had given false testimony were released from their obligations and given the choice of honesty going forward. Ibrahim was restored as crown prince, not by ceremony alone, but by a formal reinvestigation and public declaration by the royal council, a process that had never been done before and became a precedent. He insisted on it. He said that his return could not rest on the king's affection alone, but must rest on what was actually true. Zainab was honored by the village of Tudungaskiya with a formal naming ceremony attended by elders from 3 surrounding communities. She was not given a title. She did not want one. What she wanted, she said, was for her child to be born into a kingdom that had faced a lie and chosen the harder thing. She believed now that it had. What Ibrahim and Zainab were to each other beyond that moment continued in the way that real things continue, imperfectly, honestly, negotiated between 2 people who had met in full rather than arranged. That is a longer story, but it began here. As for Hadiza, she was not imprisoned. What she faced was something harder than prison for a woman who had always craved admiration. She went back to the village, and she lived there, and she had to live with being known. Not hated, not forgiven immediately either. Simply known for what she had felt, for what she had chosen, for the fear and want that had made her capable of something she could not undo. The elders said that was consequence enough. Perhaps it was. Consequences that last are rarely the ones we expect. At the meeting tree in Tudungaskiya, on the evening after everything settled, Malam Kabir sat in his usual chair as the sun went down behind the western hill, and he said to the 3 young people sitting near him, "You understand now what the well says?" They nodded. It does not say truth wins quickly. It does not say truth wins painlessly. He adjusted his hat. It says it returns. It always returns. Your job is only to be standing somewhere useful when it does. The tree above them was older than anyone's memory. It had listened to many things. This was simply the latest. Somewhere inside the kingdom, a child waited to be born, a child who would arrive into a world that had been, at significant cost, corrected. That cost had been paid by a girl with bare feet and a knotted cloth, and the particular bravery of someone who had no power except the truth and chose to carry it anyway. That is the story of the farm girl. If it moved you, if it made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like this video and subscribe so you do not miss the next story. And in the comments below, tell me, have you ever had a moment where you were asked to choose between loyalty and something that felt like opportunity? Tell your story. This community listens. Gaskia Bata boy. Truth does not hide. It always returns.